Today is September 4th, 2024, and this is William Michael. I'm the headmaster of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, which is working to preserve and promote classical Catholic education for modern students. If you'd like to learn about the work we're doing, I invite you to visit our website at classicalliberarts.com. Also, if you're listening on YouTube, I'd like to ask you to subscribe to the channel if you enjoy the talks. It's good for us to be able to see how many people are listening, and it also helps to promote our videos in searches for others. So it's a simple way to help us promote these studies. I received a question in the comments from an Academy mother, which I thought was a very good question, and I'd like to devote some time to it today and give it a full talk rather than respond privately. She wrote the following. Let me pull it up real quick. I wonder if you might do a talk on the role of science in young children's education. I feel like I'm surrounded by homeschool families that put science on a pedestal. Their kids can name every dinosaur, go into detail about weather and ecosystems. If you name an animal, they know where it's from and its species and so on. I feel like I'm the crazy one for not focusing on it, focusing on science, that is. Of course, we have things like an animal encyclopedia and whatnot that we read for fun, but we don't study them. For elementary age children, how important is science and how should they study it? Really great question, obviously very important in modern society. Now, the problem with modern science is that there's a difference between science as professional scientists understand it, real researchers, real scholars in the natural sciences, and how common people understand modern science. There's a very great difference between professional scientists and common people as to how they think of science, what they think science is. And this is very significant. Just about everything that you will hear in your normal circles, unless you're a professional scientist, unless you're an academic working with professional scientists, just about everything you hear will be the common popular idea of science, which is really ignorant and unrealistic. The common idea of what science is something like this. Science is the investigation of the natural world. It's the study of nature. We could say it's the study of God's creation, if we want to sound religious and spiritual. The study of God's creation. Now, that all sounds fine, and I wouldn't necessarily say that it's false, but we have to remember that the scientific revolution took place in 1620. Let's use that date. The 1600s of the modern era, of the Christian era, around 1600 AD. So for thousands of years before Christ and for another 1600 years after Christ, we can't be so foolish to suggest that no one ever thought to study creation, or no one ever thought to study the natural world. Obviously, men spent all of history studying the natural world. We can't imagine that people never thought to investigate the natural world by means of observation or experimentation before the scientific revolution. That's ridiculous. And so if we think of things historically, And we realized that human beings did not begin to think about investigating the natural world in 1600 AD. We have to ask the question, what exactly did happen in the 1600s? What exactly is the scientific revolution? Why did education change in the 1600s? Why do modern schools, in the name of science and technology and mathematics, why did they abandon the ancient and medieval curriculum and replace it with this modern science-based learning? As the comment said, I feel like I'm surrounded by homeschool families that put science on a pedestal. The same is true in all schools. So again, the common ignorant popular idea is that men lived in ignorance. They were like a bunch of cavemen, a bunch of superstitious fools who really didn't understand how anything worked, didn't know how to investigate anything, just lived following all kinds of wives' tales and superstitious ideas until Francis Bacon in 1620 said, hey, you know what I think we should do? I think we should start looking at things and actually try to figure out what's true about the world by using our senses. That's what I think we should do. And the whole world gasped at this amazing breakthrough. You mean we should look at the world? You mean that we should turn over rocks to see what's underneath them? You think that we should travel to different places to know what's there? We never thought of that before. Now, that's obviously ridiculous. Yet, if you listen to common people talking about science, that really is what they think. Because there's so much ignorance in modern society. And these sorts of ideas don't get examined. There's no way for them to be examined. I can remember being taught in school as a kid. I went to public schools. I can remember explicitly being taught in school that before Christopher Columbus, everyone believed that the world was flat. And they believed that if you sailed across the ocean, you would sail off the edge of the world. I was taught that in school. No one knew that the world was a sphere until Christopher Columbus decided to sail across the ocean. And then, when he sailed across the ocean, everyone realized that he actually just sailed from the western edge of human civilization, and as he traveled further west, he actually came back to the east. And so it was at that time that men said, oh my goodness, the world is round. And of course, that's demonstrably, ridiculously false. The world was understood to be a sphere from ancient times. In fact, philosophers had already calculated the size of the earth in the Hellenistic age, around 300 BC. So this idea that no one ever thought of experimenting, no one ever observed the world, no one ever took notes or kept records or did experiment is just ridiculously false. So we have to ask, what exactly happened, as I said before? What happened and what's actually different? Because obviously people always studied the world. Ancient Babylon and Egypt, they were masters of astronomy. When we talk about the solar system and the heavens and the stars and the zodiac and all these different things, these things were known in ancient times. Constellations in the heaven are mentioned in the biblical book of Job, which is one of the oldest, maybe the oldest book in the Bible. These things were known in the ancient world. Men were already observing and recording and developing models and explanations for how the world was arranged and how things worked, all through ancient times. So something must be different today to allow for this attitude, this snobbery against ancient philosophy. And whatever that change was, we need to understand that, because that's where we're going to find the answer to this question about what the role of science should be in our education and how we should study it. To what extent should we study it? Why should we study it? And so on. Now, as we start to ask those questions, what is science? How should we study science? To what end should we study science? The problem is, those are all philosophical questions. And so if we're going to make science the focus of our education and put it up on a pedestal and don't learn reasoning and philosophy, we can't answer questions like that. We can't answer questions about what science is, or what the purpose of science is, or how science should be studied, to what end science should be studied, and so on. And this is the problem that we see around us in modern society. They hit the ground running, racing after this thing they called science, and if you were to stop them and said, hey, wait a minute, can you tell me, what is science? What's the purpose of science? What are you hoping to accomplish? How should we go about studying science? How much do we need to know to say that we've learned science? What are the answers to these questions? You will find that people don't even think about these things, because they've all been taught that this is what advanced, civilized, intelligent people do, and there's no other option. So this is the problem with a society that has abandoned the study of reasoning and philosophy and religion. They just do whatever is being done, assuming it to be the latest and greatest breakthrough in human advancement or human progress. And of course, that's ridiculous. We can demonstrate that quite easily. So let's try to answer some of these questions, and I do answer these questions in some of the courses in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. For example, if you're an adult and you get a copy of the book that's available freely on the website, it's titled Understanding Classical Catholic Education. It will explain all of this in some detail. It's an easy book to read, not academic or technical. It's intended for parents. So if you'd like to take a look at that, you can download a free copy on the Academy website. That's one place you can really dig into this topic. But more simply, in the World Chronology course, which is a history course intended for students, we go through the history from ancient times through I think to this period of the Protestant schism and the scientific revolution and so on. And students learn pretty clearly what's taken place and what this development of scientific thinking in the modern world is really about. So there are places where we learn about this in the curriculum. But for the sake of a talk, for a general audience, I'd like to just do a little bit of chronology work to explain what happened in history and what we mean by science today, and that will help us to understand the place it should have, how we should study it, and so on. In 1620, as I mentioned before, an English philosopher named Francis Bacon wrote a work called the Novum Organum. Novum Organum. And what that means is the new instrument or the new method. And this new method is what we refer to today as the scientific method. So it's important to note that in 1620, whatever this was, it was called new by the man who was promoting it. It was called new. And if there is a new method, there must have been something understood to be the old method. So the new method must have been presented as a replacement for whatever the old method was. So what was the old method? Well, that word in Latin, organum, in Greek is organon. Similar word, a little bit different because we're talking about two different languages, Latin and Greek. But that word organon came from the works of Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher who lived around 350 BC. So again, 1620 for this new organon, this new instrument, 1620, keep that date in mind. And Aristotle's organon, or old instrument, in around 350 BC. So what's that, 1970? Almost 2,000 years apart. Now, when we look at Aristotle's instrument, Aristotle's organon, what we find is a collection of books through which Aristotle teaches the art of reasoning. The art of reasoning. And of course, in modern times, everyone assumes that they know what reasoning is, but they don't. Because you have to study the art of reasoning to actually understand the art of reasoning. Just because you have a vague idea of what reasoning is, you think that reasoning means thinking. You think that being logical means making sense when you say things. That's not the art of reasoning. The art of reasoning is a very complex system of concepts and rules that teach us how the mind actually works to discover truth and to demonstrate truth so that we can have certainty in things that we know. And Aristotle is actually the one to discover this art and teach it in a systematic way. And he did this in the books which together are called the organon, the instrument. So from the time of Aristotle, 350 BC, before Christ, for 350 years until the Christian era, and then for 1620 years into the Christian era, a total of almost 2,000 years, Aristotle's organon, Aristotle's instrument, was understood as the method for seeking truth. The method for seeking truth. So any education that existed, any formal education, consisted of learning Aristotle's instrument and putting it to work. That's what it meant to be educated. So when we look back, this is where what I teach as classical Catholic education came from. It's called classical because it extends back before the time of Christ to the classical age, to ancient Greece and Rome, and even before that. And I explain all of this in that book, Understanding Classical Catholic Education. But it extends back to classical times, so it's not really even Christian because it's pre-Christian. But it's adopted by the Christian doctors of the church because it's true. And so what started before Christianity was established, the classical liberal arts curriculum, classical philosophy, and so on, was perfected by Christians, perfected by the doctors and wise men of the Catholic Church. And it was perfected because it was brought into harmony with Catholic teaching. And this union of classical philosophy with Catholic theology is called scholasticism. Scholasticism. And the representative of scholasticism in history is St. Thomas Aquinas, who lived around, let's just say, 1250 AD. So even after the time of Thomas Aquinas, when this system of classical learning was brought to its perfection, it continued as the way of truth-seeking for another 400 years, until Francis Bacon, who was not a Catholic, proposed this new method. And this new method that he proposed is what we call the scientific method. Now, you may have also heard of the Socratic method. Well, the Socratic method was another approach to learning that was established by the Greek philosopher Socrates even before Aristotle. So we've got the Socratic method, which was before, let's say, 400 BC. Then we've got the Aristotelian method around 350 BC. And then that continues as the method until 1620 AD, when an alternative is presented. Now, obviously, for all of human history, men used their senses to investigate the natural world. Obviously, there were ancient astronomers studying the heavens. There were men traveling all through the world, men making maps, men studying animals and plants. People were making all of their food. They were building houses, building ships, building military equipment and devices, on and on and on. Human beings were studying and learning and testing things and working and producing things and improving things for all of human history. So when we come to the scientific method, we can't stupidly think that this was the beginning of human thinking or human investigation or observation. There's something more to it, and we have to be subtle in our thinking to understand what's going on. Now, as I said, Thomas Aquinas had led the work of perfecting classical learning by uniting it to Catholic theology, to divine revelation. Once that was established by St. Thomas Aquinas, the world was pretty much trapped by scholasticism. Scholasticism was so firmly established as true and just invincible that people who were not Catholics were really stuck in a difficult situation, because philosophy, if rightly studied and rightly understood, led to Catholicism. And Catholicism meant submission to the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, submission to the moral teaching of the Catholic Church, the moral teaching of Christ. Anyone who was not interested in living a Christian life was trapped by scholasticism. They were trapped by ancient, classical, medieval learning. And there was just no way out of it. They were in a stranglehold that they couldn't escape from. So the question of how can we possibly suggest something other than Christianity? There was no way to do it as long as the old method was employed as the means of truth-seeking. So these clever, anti-Catholic modern men, led by Francis Bacon and his work, The Novum Organum, proposed that we hit the reset button and start learning from scratch. They accused the ancient world of leading men into falsehood and superstition. And they said the only way that we can escape from all of this false teaching and superstition is to start learning all over again. And when we do this, when we restart all human learning, this is called the Great Instauration. When we restart human learning, we have to avoid all philosophy and all religion. We can't allow philosophy or religion to direct us in our study of the world. We can only use the senses, because the senses are the only source of truth. We can only be certain that a thing is true if we can observe it with the senses. So what's significant about the scientific method is not that men begin using their senses. They had always done that. But men not be allowed to use philosophy or religion as they investigate the world. So the new method, the scientific method, is a secular approach to learning that does not allow us to use philosophy or religion to direct our studies. This is what begins in the scientific revolution. Now, some people will say things, when you ask, why is science put on a pedestal? Whatever it is that they call science, because that's another problem. Whatever it is that they call science, why is it put on a pedestal like this? And they'll say things like, oh, well, all of the scientific discoveries and breakthroughs that have occurred since the scientific revolution have just been amazing. I mean, it's amazing. Can you even believe that from the 1600s, when the scientific revolution began, in just 370 years or 350 years, men could travel to the moon? Today we can communicate with wireless technology. The advances in medicine and surgeries and transportation, all these, it's just amazing what science has done. And we listen to that and say, it sounds like they're onto something, because it does seem that there are all kinds of breakthroughs. When I was a kid, we didn't have smartphones, we didn't have the internet, there were no electric cars. So it's clear that there are great developments in technology. It appears that there are these great breakthroughs and great advances, and that human society is changing and so on. But when we don't examine that philosophically or religiously, we're easily led astray. And we imagine that just because there are new things developing, that human culture is actually making some kinds of upward progress. And that's not necessarily true. In order to get into a discussion like that, we can't use science. We have to use philosophy. We have to use religion. And this is one of the key differences between the ancient method and the modern method. The ancient method asks the question, why? The new method does not ask why. It simply asks what. And this is an important difference, because if you believe in God, if you believe that the world was created by an eternal, all-powerful, all-knowing creator, and that creator made all things for a certain purpose, his own will, that will now determines what's good and bad in the world. That will determines what's up and down, what's right and wrong, and so on. And so these moral questions, or these questions about ends, whether something is allowed or not allowed, they have no part in the scientific method, and yet they're of the utmost importance to anyone who believes. So when we say, oh, these great technological breakthroughs are radically advancing human culture, a religious person or a philosopher will ask, are we sure that the human race is progressing? And I would argue that intelligent Christians would answer, no, we're not progressing. There are new things and there are changes, but they are not making us better. They may give us some new opportunities to do things, but they also introduce many terrible temptations that didn't exist before. There may be new treatments for diseases, for example. There may be new surgeries or medicines that are available. But if we go back in history, we find that people prepared for death by taking care of their spiritual responsibilities and making sure that they were living in harmony with God's will, and to them that was more important than saving their body or extending their life. That leads us to really ask, which approach to life is more advanced? A life with new interesting developments in devices and technology, or a life that is actually preparing responsibly for eternity? What are the priorities? Well, those are philosophical or religious questions, and those questions are not permitted in the modern, secular, scientific laboratory or classroom. So we've got very important questions to ask, but they're philosophical and religious. And when we take religion and philosophy out of the curriculum, when we take them out of the school, for example, modern schools do not study logic, which is the foundation of true philosophy. Modern schools don't teach the art of reasoning. Modern schools don't teach the classical liberal arts of grammar, reasoning, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, which were understood to be the arts by which we seek wisdom. We don't talk about wisdom in modern schools. And so we can see that when the commenter says, let me just pull this comment up again. Sorry about that. I'm surrounded by homeschool families. Their kids can name every dinosaur, go into detail about weather and ecosystems. If you name an animal, they can tell where it's from, what its species, and so on. I feel like I'm crazy. If we look at what they're actually doing, what is the real value of what they're doing? Is what they're learning actually true? How can we know whether something is true or false? When you say they can name every dinosaur, how do we know what the name of anything is? How do we know what the true name or the false name is? How do we know that dinosaurs existed if they existed thousands and thousands and thousands of years ago? We know information about the weather and ecosystems. Okay, are we suggesting that people in the ancient world didn't know about weather, didn't know about ecosystems? How would we prove what they did know or didn't know? Does anyone actually show us what ancient people taught about weather and ecosystems? Or do we just assume that they were all ignorant, superstitious cavemen, dancing around fires and banging on drums and making human sacrifices so that it would rain? Is that really true about the ancient world? Where is evidence that these things that are assumed of the ancient world are in fact true? These are philosophical questions. These are historical questions. Some of these are religious questions, and none of these subjects are studied. So how do we know whether this so-called scientific knowledge is in fact true? How do we know if it's actually valuable? How do we know if it's useful? How do we know that it's more valuable than other kinds of learning that we're ignoring? How do we know those things if we're not allowed to first address questions of philosophy and religion? If we're not going to study moral philosophy first, how do we know that anything that we're doing is good? If we're not going to study theology first, how do we know that anything we're saying is true or right or better than something else? We can't answer those questions. And I don't think most people are asking those questions. Now, as I mentioned before, if we talk to professional scientists, if we talk to the men and women who actually work in research, who actually do the work of modern science, we'll find that their opinions of science are very different from those of common people who talk about science, those of homeschool families or school teachers that talk about science. TV shows, and so on. If we actually talk to professional scientists, we'll find that they have much less of an opinion, much lower of an opinion of science than common people do. Because real scientists, real researchers know that the usefulness of the scientific method is actually very, very limited. The scientific method, observing things in the world, is actually not very useful at all. It's not very useful at all. Even if we think about the information that was mentioned in the comment, the names of dinosaurs, all details of, let's say, I'll add some things here. The names of all the plants and animals, the names of all the stars, what else? Geography, all of the information about the countries and cities and rivers and lakes and oceans and so on. All of this factual information. What is the real use of this information? We might do well on Jeopardy. We might be really smart sitting around a table, playing a trivia game. But what is the real use of this information? What most people think the use of that information is not true. They are not gaining as valuable an education as they imagine that they are. And like I said, professional scientists understand this. So let's think about this a little bit. What can we actually do with this encyclopedic information? Where did this idea that education should be encyclopedic come from? It came from the Protestant Reformation. It came from the scientific revolution. And I can show you where in history it developed. If you travel back in time, as I mentioned before, and you go back to around 1600, you will find that encyclopedic learning began after that period when the scientific revolution was started by Francis Bacon with the Novum Organum. That's where this idea that what it means to be well educated is to know a lot of encyclopedic information. Before that, that was never the approach taken to education. Education was not encyclopedic for a number of reasons. First of all, encyclopedic knowledge isn't certain. It isn't certain. And we can see examples all around us of where information that was treated as if it was certain is later found to not be certain. But before the Protestant, I don't want to call it the Reformation, the Protestant schism and the scientific revolution, before that, the focus of education was on learning the classical liberal arts and the philosophical sciences, learning the theological science, and so on. So ancient education or classical education is not about encyclopedic learning. Classical education is about learning the classical liberal arts and the philosophical sciences. That's what pre-modern education was interested in. So if you go back in history, you'll see that the school was teaching children grammar. It was teaching children the grammar of their own native language. It was teaching them the grammar of the classical languages, Latin and Greek. It was teaching grammar because grammar is an art. It was not teaching language in an encyclopedic way. It was teaching grammar in the form of an art. The same is true of reasoning. It was teaching the art of reasoning, the art of rhetoric, the art of arithmetic, the art of geometry and of music and of astronomy. It taught the 7 liberal arts. In addition to the 7 liberal arts, it taught the philosophical sciences, moral philosophy, natural philosophy, which consists of physics and metaphysics. It taught the philosophical sciences, which were based on the 7 liberal arts. And it taught the theological science later in the Christian era, and again brought to perfection in the time of St. Thomas Aquinas. It taught arts and sciences. And that's what arts and sciences meant. It did not seek encyclopedic learning. No one went to school for encyclopedic learning. If you go back, and we can prove this historically, this isn't my opinion. If we go back, let's say, to 1599, which is a very important date because it's before Francis Bacon wrote the Novum Organum, but it's about that same time, but before. If we go back and look at the Jesuit Ratio Studiorum, or Rule of Studies, we can see the course of studies that was pursued in Jesuit schools in the 16th century. And we'll find no mention of any encyclopedic studies. We'll find little to no mention of any arithmetic or math. We'll find little to no mention of any sort of experimental science or informational sciences. We'll find little to no mention of history or geography or anything like that. No encyclopedic learning. What we'll find in that old Jesuit rule of studies, and we're talking about elementary school kids, we will find instruction in the classical liberal arts and the philosophical sciences. No encyclopedic learning. If we look at a modern school, we find exactly the opposite. We find encyclopedic learning. And most embarrassingly, we'll find many schools today that call themselves Christian schools, which emphasize encyclopedic learning even more. They refer to encyclopedic learning as absolute truth, and they'll say things like, we believe in absolute truth, and therefore we spend a lot of time memorizing information. And they talk about this encyclopedic learning like it's some sort of virtue. But the problem with that, even though they call it classical education, is classical education was not seeking encyclopedic learning. Encyclopedic learning is modern education. It's this secular, sensory-based learning where we learn about things that we can see and we can touch, taste, hear, and smell. And so we learn the details about things. We learn encyclopedic information, but we don't learn arts. We don't learn sciences. Because we don't even know, in a secular worldview, we don't even know if there is any such thing as a science or a purpose or an end of anything. All we know is what we can hold with our hands or see with our eyes. That's the modern materialist, secular worldview. And the only thing that it can do is collect encyclopedic information. And we see modern schools, and inexplicably, we see modern homeschool families doing the same thing, just gobbling up encyclopedic information. Now, why is that not desirable? Why is that not desirable? The first reason is because we can't even be certain that encyclopedic learning is true. For example, if I want to argue and prove something, let's say that I want to argue that someone committed a crime. And so I go in a courtroom and I make a historical assertion. If I say that on January 12th, 2018, this person did this thing. I make a historical statement. Will that be accepted as evidence that convicts the person of the crime? No. Why? Because a historical statement doesn't prove itself. What we seek in a trial, in a courtroom, is we seek proof. Historical statements are not proofs because we don't know if the historical statements are true. And so if you open up a history book and start reading, and are reading about Christopher Columbus or the Revolutionary War or the ancient Roman Empire, The book is just filled with assertions. And you have no way to know or prove that most or all of those assertions are in fact true. The information is not certain. All of those historical assertions would need to be proven before they could ever be accepted as true. Now, normally we don't do that. Normally, we don't care to do that. We're really just reading for entertainment. So if I want to read about the Punic Wars and I read some book that tells the history of the Punic Wars, I don't know if the assertions in the book are true or not. I may read with an optimistic attitude and say, I give the writer the benefit of the doubt. He seems like a serious guy, but no, I can't tell that the historical information is absolutely certain or not. And so it's not a source of truth. We can't know if it's true unless it's actually demonstrated to be true. And just think of what a laborious task that would be to say, we're going to study history for the sake of truth. And in order to do that, every assertion that is made of any historical person or event must be demonstrated to be true before we will accept it as true. There would be no way to make any progress. And so what we have to ask is, how valuable is this encyclopedic information? How valuable? How certain are we that this information is true? And if we're not absolutely certain that it's true, how can we actually use it? The fact that we repeat it, does that mean that we're speaking the truth? Not if we're uncertain whether it's true or not. Can we base arguments based on historical statements that can't be proven true? So if Tommy can name all of the dinosaurs and he can talk about all these different classes and populations of dinosaurs that roamed the earth, how do we know that dinosaurs roamed the earth? Oh, well, we have examples of dinosaur bones. What does the example of a dinosaur bone or some dinosaur bones tell us about any population of dinosaurs? It really doesn't tell us much at all. It's not very useful information. Interesting maybe, entertaining maybe, but really not very helpful, if we're honest. It's not very useful information. And after all, the whole question is, what is true? What is true? The question is, what happened? And once we ask the question, what happened, we have to ask the next question, which is, how can we know? How can we know what happened? How can we know whether there were dinosaurs or how many dinosaurs there were? What kinds of dinosaurs there were? How can we know that? We can propose a theory, but then we're supposed to test the theory. How will we test the theory? It just leads us to more questions and to more questions and to more questions. And so for those who actually work in the sciences, for those who actually do historical research, for those who actually do archaeological research, they know that the information they have is really not very useful. And that's what's wrong about encyclopedic learning. It's interesting, it may be entertaining, it may make you a great person to have conversations with, but we don't know if what you're saying is actually true. And so there's much more important things to study, which we actually can be certain are true. For example, geometry. We can study ancient geometry. We can learn the axioms, the postulates, and definitions in Euclid's opening book of the elements of geometry. And we can start with some definitions to establish the meanings of terms, to agree on the meanings of terms, because terms and their definitions are made up by men. It's our language. We tell you, if I say the word line, this is what I mean. If I say the word point, this is what I mean. And we agree to use the same spoken symbols for ideas by defining the words that we're going to use. And then I take an axiom like if two different things are both equal to a third thing, if two different things are both equal to a third thing, then they must be equal to one another. That's absolutely true. That's certainly true. So if I can show that two sides of a triangle are the same length as a third side of the triangle, I can conclude that those two other sides are equal to each other, and all three of them are equal. And I can prove that an equilateral triangle exists. And that knowledge and that proof are absolutely certain. The modern sciences can't do that. Now, why can't they do that? Well, because when we reason, which was the ancient method for learning, for truth-seeking, when we reason, we start with things that we know to be absolutely certain. We start with things that are true, and we use them to draw conclusions about new things that we know are true because they're drawn from true things. So we move from general statements to specific statements. So for example, if I say that God made man and the first parent of the human race, Adam, disobeyed God, and as a result God punished man and the entire human race. Notice I'm talking about a whole class. The entire human race was cursed with the punishment of death. I now have a truth that's based on divine revelation that is absolutely certain for one who has faith. And I can assert that any creature that is a man will die. Any creature that is a man is mortal. I can make that individual statement with absolute certainty because I have an absolutely certain statement that's true about the entire class. And so I reason from the class, what I know about the class, down to the individual. That's called deduction. I reason from the class what's known about the class, about every member of the class. I reason down to an individual member of that class. That's deductive reasoning. That's the Aristotelian method. That's the ancient method of truth-seeking. And what you see is our ability to talk about things may be limited, but it's certain, it's valuable, it's useful. We can build our lives upon that knowledge that's gained through philosophical study, through deductive reasoning. That's the old method. The new method works the other way around. Modern science works like this. I go outside and I walk beside the pond and I see a swan, and I see that it's a white swan. And then I open a book, and in this book I see a picture of a different pond in a different place, and I see a swan, and it's a white swan. And then I travel to a friend's house in another state, and we're driving past a pond or a lake, and I look out and I see swans in the lake, and I see 7 swans, and they're all white. And so now I've seen 9 swans. And every single swan that I've seen, every individual swan that I've seen is white. And so I draw the conclusion and I say, all swans are white. All swans are white, because really, What use is knowing that 7 swans that I've seen are white? How is that useful? It's not useful. What's useful is knowledge of a class. And so what I try to do is make a conclusion, make an assertion about a class of things based on my observation of individual members of that class. What's the problem with that? I only saw 9 swans. There are thousands and thousands, maybe millions of swans in the world. I saw 7 of them and made a conclusion about the entire class of swans. Is that absolutely certain? Of course not. It's not very useful knowledge. My observational knowledge is not very useful. Now, if I was going to use the modern method of observation and experimentation to try to draw general conclusions that were absolutely true, what would I need to do? What would I need to do to make absolutely certain generalized statements about entire classes of things which would be useful? What must I do to make those statements? I must observe every single individual member of the class. I must observe every single member of the class in order to draw a universal conclusion about that class. Now I'd like to ask you, how many classes of things are we capable of examining every single individual specimen of? And the answer is almost none. That's how unuseful scientific knowledge is. Now, I can make assumptions that may be possible or probable or even likely. I can draw conclusions and say something like, if my friend called me on the phone and told me that he saw a swan, I could assume or picture a white bird. And I would probably be right. It's likely that the swan would be white. And I would reason that way because I've seen 9 swans and they were all white. So if someone tells me they saw a swan, I'll assume it's a white bird. But I'm not certain that it was a white bird. And in fact, I can learn that there are black swans. So scientific language is helpful in the sense that it can allow us to make some possible or probable statements, but it doesn't allow us to make certain statements, and therefore it's actually less valuable than the old method of philosophical reasoning. That's why schools in the old days taught the liberal arts and sciences of philosophy and theology, but modern schools are teaching encyclopedic information and giving kids a false sense of confidence that they're all smart because they can rattle off the names of dinosaurs and talk about the weather and name all the countries and cities and rivers on a map. But if you were to ask the children, how do you know that that's true? Or you can ask them even, is that actually true? How do you know that's true? You'll see some real trouble. We'll see that this learning isn't very impressive after all. We'll see that what they're really doing is simply accepting as true what's written in the books, which is not what learning is about. In fact, the scientific method is about investigation. The scientific method is about conducting experiments and asking questions, proposing theories and testing those theories. That's why I said professional scientists don't think science is anything like what common people pretend it is. It's not a science textbook. In fact, the science textbook is almost the opposite of what science actually is. Science is really about seeking solutions to challenging questions by proposing theories that seem like reasonable answers to those questions, and then testing those theories to find out if they're true. That's what real science is. That's not what students are doing in science classes. In fact, what they're doing is the opposite of science, which is just accepting statements as true without any evidence, without conducting any experiments, without testing whether these statements are true or not. So in fact, it's not scientific at all. It's part of this ignorant, common, intellectual culture that really has no idea what it's doing. So I think that's enough about the problems with scientific learning or encyclopedic learning and how it differs from what real scientists actually think science is. So to get to the question with all of that as some background information, when we ask what is the role of science in education, you can see the problem even in that question. I'll ask, what do you mean by science? Do you mean the scientific method? That's not what these kids are doing. These kids are not using the scientific method. Do you mean memorizing information and accepting it as true because you believe that some scientist somewhere has proven this? Well, that's not science at all. That's simply belief. And remember, belief is not supposed to be allowed in the modern scientific environment. Everything is supposed to be tested. Everything is supposed to be obtained by experimentation. We're supposed to be able to reproduce experiments and prove what we say is true. But we don't do that in modern scientific circles. We just accept information as true because it's in the textbook, it's in the encyclopedia, and so on. Scientists don't do that. So what is the role of science? Well, we see it's very limited. It's not very useful. Interesting, entertaining, yes, but useful, not so much. What's more important than asking what's the role of science is asking, are we teaching our children the classical liberal arts, the philosophical and theological sciences? Do they actually have the information that's important? Are they learning the arts and sciences? The arts of wisdom seeking? Are they learning those things? And if we're going to talk about science, are they actually understanding and learning what modern professional scientists actually do? Because most students have no idea. Most students have no idea how professional research works. It's a very boring world. It's not very productive. It's very difficult, very time-consuming, very expensive, and maybe, in the end, a great failure. But at the same time, there is obviously a level of just common encyclopedic knowledge that's necessary for the sake of communication, right? There is established encyclopedic knowledge, which really is just vocabulary. It's really just vocabulary. So if you see an animal and you point to that animal and say, what is it? Men will all agree and say, oh, that's a bear. And if you see another animal, point to it and say, what is it? Men will agree and say, oh, that's a deer. That's just vocabulary. We're just defining terms. That's obviously necessary for the sake of communication, just like if we point up to the sky and say, what is that? And someone says, the sky. And if we point to a tree and say, what is that? Someone may say, that's a cedar tree. That's just vocabulary. So the question, is that sort of information gathering helpful? It's helpful as vocabulary. It's really developing our ability to communicate. It's a language study. But intentionally learning things that are obscure and not spoken of so that one can pretend to be smart based on how many levels of obscure information he has memorized. That's not real learning. That's not human learning. And the way we can prove that it's not human learning is that this is the kind of knowledge that computers have. This is what Google can do. This is what ChatGPT can do. It's not human learning. It's machine learning. It's just memory and storage. It's not reasoning. It's not rational, intellectual activity. It's just storage for the sake of vocabulary. So there does need to be scientific education. I wouldn't waste much time trying to pretend that we're scientists or that we're raising scientists because, as I said, science is a profession. If a kid wants to be a scientist, that's a decision he makes when he's 20 years old, not when he's 12. Because he has to actually learn how science works, how scientific research in the real world actually works. We need to develop a general knowledge of scientific things, and this is provided for very easily. In the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, for example, we have an elementary science program. It's called Elementary Science, and all that it does is introduce basic concepts of modern science, basic concepts of chemistry, of physics, of biology, and so on, basic vocabulary of the modern natural sciences, concepts by telling stories and things like that. It's very simple, and that's really all that I think students need. Besides, if we're going to be honest about real science, if a student wants to be a real scientist, he's going to have to study the modern mathematical sciences on which modern science is based. So he's going to have to get into algebra and trigonometry and precalculus and calculus. So any talk about real science will manifest itself by an interest in the modern mathematical sciences, the advanced mathematical sciences, which really are the instrument of the modern sciences. And there's a lot of other issues that need to be learned, like the research process and scientific writing and things like that. All of those things are studied at the university level, where one actually has access to the research labs and to the researchers with whom a student can work to actually learn how to do research professionally. That has nothing to do with a K-12 education. We can introduce some of those things to make children aware of professional options in research and development and scientific investigation, but that's really not what any schools are doing. Many schools pretend to be doing that, and it's just nonsense. It's just a terrible waste of money, a terrible waste of time, and as I said, it's always done instead of more important studies. It's done instead of more important studies. The study of moral philosophy is more important than the study of chemistry or physics. The study of theology, where we learn about divine revelation, is more important than the study of human anatomy or astronomy. Moral philosophy teaches us what the end of human life is. Theology teaches how the world was made, where man came from, what God's will is for man, how man can obtain eternal life, and so on. Those things are far more important than being able to name all of the bones and muscles in the human body. Those things are objectively more important. And yet, if we look at modern curricula, if we look at modern public schools, modern Catholic schools, modern Protestant schools, modern so-called classical schools, we find that all of them neglect the most important subjects, and they have replaced those important subjects with these encyclopedic subjects that are very poorly studied and taught. So, what is the role? I would say, since state laws usually require that we introduce our children to the study of the natural sciences, we do that. We fulfill the law. And as I said, that's very easy to do. We do it in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy by making, I think it's K through 8 or grade 1 through 8 of an elementary science program, which has the children read through a series of books on the topics, general topics of the natural sciences. It's sufficient. It's all the kids need. We then, when they get to the high school level, we have the required modern high school sciences, biology, physics, chemistry, and then they can choose astronomy or anatomy and physiology. So we have the normal high school series of courses. But outside of that, I would say really all you're doing is building vocabulary, and you can explain how useful that is only if you're also able to show that your children are learning the more important subjects, moral philosophy, divine revelation, and so on. Those are more important, objectively more important. So I think that covers most of the issues regarding this question. I'm sorry that it feels like we're surrounded by people who do this. We're surrounded by this encyclopedic learning, and especially in Christian circles where it makes even less sense. But Christians are not discerning today, and they don't know the history. If you ask them about the history of education, ask them about the things that I've talked about in this talk, you'll find they don't even think about these things. They don't ask these questions. They don't know about these developments historically. And so they're spending their time gathering information that I can obtain in 3 seconds by submitting a search to Google. They're spending their children's K to 12 years collecting information in the Google age, which makes no sense. They're collecting information in the ChatGPT generation, which just makes no sense. And instead of focusing on real human learning, they're raising kids as if imitating a computer is honorable. And those kids are going to be in trouble when they find that in the market, as they become adults, their encyclopedic learning, as impressive as it may have been in, at a birthday party or in the living room, can't even stand a chance against the information capability of a computer or a smartphone or ChatGPT or any other computer device. And so they're being trained for something that really makes no sense. And again, I know it's difficult because it's so common and popular, and the attitudes of people who study like that are so arrogant, and they act like they've got some kind of higher knowledge when in fact they're dealing with inferior species of knowledge than what we should be studying, which are the classical liberal arts and the philosophical and theological sciences. So that's my answer. And again, that's a very long, detailed answer, but the simple answer is this. We've already provided for an elementary science program in the academy. Use it. It's simple. It covers all the requirements. It doesn't waste much time. But more importantly, we also provide all of the more important subjects to be studied, which should be our focus. I hope that's helpful. If you have any other questions, would like to talk about any of these issues more in detail, remember, I published a book that addresses the history of education and talks about all of these things as they developed in time with lots of evidence provided and things like that to sort of weave this whole history together. So you can look at that as a source. But if you have any questions or would like to comment on any of these things, feel free to do so. You can write to me in the comments on YouTube, or you can just email me by writing to wcm@classicalliberalarts.com. WCM, just my initials, William C. Michael, WCM@classicalliberalarts.com. I hope that's helpful. God bless.